Good afternoon, everyone. As co-chairs of the Colorado Trustee Network, Sarah Hughes and I are pleased to welcome you to our first 2022 virtual event. The network is made up of trustees, both elected and appointed, from all the public institutions of higher education in the state. Our goal is to become more effective advocates by speaking with one voice on key post-secondary issues. Today, I'd like to give a special shout out to Dr. Angie Piccioni, who, as you all know, directs the Colorado Department of Higher Education. Angie, thank you for your leadership and your attendance today. I would now like to introduce our moderator, Kristen Holquist. Kristen is a trustee at MSU Denver. She also is a first-generation college graduate, and she is a proud member of the 1330 Task Force. And Kristen, I'll turn this over to you now.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm thrilled that you've taken time out of this day to be with us. There's about 100 of us who are gathered together, and I appreciate that we have an opportunity to talk about something that we all care about. That's the success and workforce revitalization in Colorado. Today, we welcome Speaker Alec Garrett, Representative Julie McCluskey, and Pat Myers to discuss a critical new policy framework that's offered by a broad cross-section of Coloradoans. I also want to thank our colleagues at the Colorado Department of Higher Education who supported the 1330 Task Force, and also, again, recognition to Dr. Piccioni. So we're going to have a colleague put on a couple quick slides. I'm going to get us kicked off quite fast with just a quick overview. Terrific. So quick, last year with COVID, we had the opportunity with HB 1330 to be able to really bring together a broad cross-section of our residents, people from a variety of different stakeholder groups, to give advice to the General Assembly. And we delivered that advice in the middle of December. It was advice focused on how we could focus on student success and workforce revitalization. A couple points I want to leave you with before we kick off the main event. So in the next slide. I can't underscore enough just how diverse and fast-paced was this process. There were 26 of us. We met in different task forces, 3 of them. We had meetings. We met entirely by Zoom. Thank you, COVID. And we approved the final report at the end of the year last year. We were able to, we literally started with 95 recommendations. And that comes from folks from the business community, from the advocacy community, from our K-12 partner schools, and then of course from our post-secondary institutions. Got that down to 15, worked a little further, and we have our top 6, which I will speak to very briefly. Thank you. So in terms of these 6, they're going to look like a series of recommendations that I hope you will see some commonality around. The first, as I said, focused on student success and revitalization. You'll see a premium on partnerships and collaboration, a premium on data and transparency, new metrics of the success that will define a system that's focused on the learner and their pathways throughout their life. We came together really animated by one statistic that our economy will be powered by STEM jobs, and half of which have a half-life of just about 2.5 years. So we really do need here in Colorado a system of lifelong career-connected learning that's rooted in the unique job markets and the growing industries of our different regions. We spent a lot of time talking about equity and disparities too. We did it in a positive language. We're confident that Colorado can rise to this challenge, this inflection point that we're at right now. That's motivated not just by the infusion of federal funds, one-time funds, which as the governor charged us can be bottom-up innovation for the improvements we need to better serve learners across their lifetime. But we really focused in on 3 data points. The kind of data points that do kick us in the gut and actually we think will galvanize us as trustees and colleagues across Colorado's post-secondary learning ecosystem. The first is we unfortunately do rank 50th or last in the gap between whites and Latinos. And this is a state where our fastest growing population are our Latinos, and where we take very proudly our social justice missions. We do rank 47th in public investment in our post-secondary education system. And that's even after we've been able to make annual increases over inflation for the last 5 years. And then last, we have about 10 years to get this right, because in 10 years, our boomers are going to be retiring, and they will bring with them a series of needs that will outpace any other in the economy, according to our demographer. They'll drive our transportation, our housing, and our healthcare policy conversations and investments. So with no time to waste, we release this report with a recommendation that we have a strategic finance plan, really look to our future and how will Colorado invest in the talent it needs. I'll pivot now. I'd love to, with that charge in front of us, ask the speaker to comment on what he sees are the needs of the state and how he finds this report responsive to those.
Thanks so much, Kristen, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for jumping on. I was scrolling through the Zoom screen, and I saw so many friendly faces. And it's tough with COVID because we don't get the opportunity to see each other as much as we have in the past. But thank you so much for taking the time, Kristen and Elaine. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to this group, and let me just start by thanking Pat Myers and Representative McCluskey for all of their hard work to really help get this 1330 process off of the ground. And then I really want to thank the trustees, the other members of the legislature who were engaged in this robust process. It was a really big endeavor that was expertly facilitated, in my opinion, to kind of get to where we are today. But it required a big investment of time and energy. And so I really am grateful to each of you who participated and who played a part. Policymaking, especially in Colorado, works best when we all have the opportunity to come to the table and to work together on some of the hardest problems we're facing. And I think sort of workforce and workforce development and the future of higher ed represents that. And, while there are challenges that COVID has presented to all of you individually, all of you in the workforce, all of us in the state of Colorado, it has also given us, I try to look at sort of the silver lining and the opportunities that it has provided us a once in a lifetime, once in a generation opportunity to make transformational change here in Colorado. And I think that's what this 1330 process represents. It's an opportunity through some very challenging, dark times for us to reemerge a stronger, better Colorado than where we entered before this pandemic. And so with that, Kristen, I'll stop because I could ramble. You just kind of give a politician like me an opportunity to just talk, and I can, but I'll stop, maybe answer any questions that you have to continue to kind of get down to the details of what this group wants to hear.
Thanks. Last one follow-up question, and then I'm going to kick it to my colleagues who've joined us today for some questions before you have to depart in 10 minutes. So as a follow-up question, just as you look to the session in front of you, do you have any thoughts about how you might work with your colleagues on the specific recommendations in this report, our big six?
Yeah, I think that one, let's just highlight the fact of how we got down to the six. It's pretty amazing that when this group started, it was at 90 recommendations. And to think in such a short amount of time, people were able to work together to kind of come and narrow down to these 6 primary areas, Kristen, that you so elegantly articulated at the beginning of this, really, I think, highlights how we are set up for success. It's probably a little too early for me to speak in detail about how I think we're going to kind of flush out specific details out of those 6. Representative McCluskey might shed a little bit more light later in the program on that, but I wanted to highlight how I think you're going to see a lot of bipartisan support in those 6 primary areas. And I think it's going to really help kind of give the legislature focus and clarity to help guide us into drafting ideas and engaging in sort of the robust public discussion that kind of comes with the legislative process. So it really is, it has set us all up for success, and the details are sort of yet to come.
Great. So with that admonition, I welcome some questions from our audience, but remember to honor the speaker's request to, the details are to come, and the bipartisan support and the focus and clarity is what you can count on from this big six. Any questions? All quiet here at 4 p.m.
That's all right, Kristen, if it's cool, I wanted to just jump in and highlight one. I just wanted to thank everybody and highlight some of the challenges that higher ed has gone through and post-secondary learning has gone through because of this pandemic. I want to thank all of you for what you're doing on behalf of so many young adults across the state. And I just want you to know, here at the legislature, we understand how challenging those times have been. And I think you're going to see us do the best we can to meet that moment, to make sure that we hear you when it comes to the support, whether or not it's in resources, the support, whether or not it's in additional assistance that you need from the legislature. So I just want to kind of take that moment to say thank you. And now that we're in session, that we're gonna do the best we can to lift everybody up, because it has been certainly a very challenging time.
There's a question in the chat if you want to read it, Kristen.
I'd be happy to. So Speaker, there's a question from one of our audience members who is asking, how do you plan to prioritize any of these recommendations if you have given any thought to that? And specifically, must we start with our data system that connects our educational outcomes with our labor market outcomes?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah, for that question. It's a great one. I think you're going to sort of see us engage in a prioritization process off of the recommendations that's led by the members that participated in the task force and who really sat through all of the work that everybody went through this summer. I think the way you understand it is correct. We would have to develop the data system, but that's a good question for Pat and for Julie, who will, I think, can kind of lend a little bit more to that. But I think what you're going to see is like the voice that was heard in the task force is going to be communicated to the legislature by those who participated closely, and then you're going to see us from a sort of a leadership, and then in all the caucuses, kind of rally behind these recommendations and develop individual legislation from them.
Thank you. Any other questions? All right, seeing none, I'll take the facilitator's prerogative and I'll ask you this question. Any bets on who will be the new owner of the Denver Broncos?
That's a great question, Kristen. You know, when we this probably isn't the best answer, but when we got the $3.8 billion from the feds, Pat probably knows this, but I urged the governor. I was like, you know, we could just take this money, and on behalf of the people of Colorado, similar to what they've done in Green Bay, we could just purchase the Broncos and everybody could be a shareholder of our sports team. We laughed, and then we quickly shifted to, let's make sure we can go into some transformational change around affordable housing, workforce, mental and behavioral health. So that's where we decided to put our money. But they desperately need to figure out the situation. If they can't figure out the ownership situation, then they're going to have trouble kind of taking those steps forward that we all expect them to.
Well, this is why we're grateful that you're representing us. In your note about investing in our team, there's also a question from Landon with our community colleges about investing in rural communities. Any thoughts about how the legislature is looking at that, including investing in the learning ecosystem that's available in rural communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, Landon, and it's one that we are always working on down here at the Capitol, right? How do we make sure that we are closing the rural-urban divide that exists in different areas, and making sure that we are, whether or not it's, thinking through the developing the stackable credentials and the work-based learning pathways, if there's ways that we can make sure that we're partnering with business leaders across the state instead of in just the metro area or in just some areas that are kind of easy to lean in on. How can we make sure that we're reaching out to those businesses in all four corners of the state, make sure that we are kind of creating those opportunities for students to build those relationships. So that's just one example that comes to mind that would make a lot of sense.
Thank you for that. Dr. Jordan, I saw that you had raised your hand through our Zoom technology. Would you like to ask a question, Speaker?
I would, thank you. And thank you, Mr. Speaker, for taking the time to be with us today. I think when I was at MSU Denver and first started working on the issue of Hispanic serving institution, we were 48th in the country in educational attainment in terms of the gap. We're now 50th. I would be interested in your thoughts, not so much about specific strategies, but what do you think are some of the big things the legislature could do to help enhance participation of students of color in our post-secondary system? I mean, it's going to be so critical for our economy that we change the direction that we're going. So do you have thoughts that you'd be willing to share with us on things you think we could do?
Yeah, Dr. Jordan, thanks. Dr. Jordan was like one of my mentors when I first came into the legislature, and was so helpful to me at sort of understanding the power of MSU in particular. So Dr. Jordan, it's great to hear your voice. Thanks for asking that question. When it comes to we have got to build in incentives to do a better job of helping institutions connect with businesses and make sure that we are helping our communities of color and our students of color make those connections in the workforce. And so there's ways for the legislature to incentivize that type of behavior to both the businesses and to encourage our institutions to really kind of lean in that way. It's critically important that we do a better job. Like you said, the fact that we've fallen to 50th is shocking, and we have to just help link. We have to link all of these priorities, and if we have to do it through incentives, if there's ways that we have to really kind of drive everyone to the table to create those solutions, I think you'll see some discussion this year at the legislature about that. But we just can't. We can't stop. We can't take a year off, and I think this pandemic has really kind of shown a light that the work is more important than ever.
Terrific. Well, on behalf of the Colorado Trustees Network and all of the participants in today's call, thank you for supporting us coming together. Thank you for your commitment to all of us and to the students we're trying to serve. So thank you, and I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Kristen. Thanks, Elaine. Thanks, everybody. I look forward to you guys are going to have a great time with Pat and Representative McCluskey, and I'll see you guys all later.
Great.
Thank you.
Hey, Kristen, can I jump in for just 1 second before we switch over?
Absolutely.
I just want to clarify that one of the reasons why we fell in terms of Hispanic and Latinx students, that we fell to 50th over the gap got bigger, was not necessarily because we were doing a poor job, but because we changed the metrics. And so to align with Lumina Foundation, who pretty much holds those metrics for the whole country, we were a bit of an outlier because we only looked at the population age up to 34, and now we're up to 64. So when we added that whole 3 decades of population, that brought us down even more. which means that what we didn't fulfill our promise, if you will, to those generations, those decades ahead of us. And so we were making great progress. Well, we were making progress. I won't say great. We were making progress when we looked at the metrics of 25 to 34. But when we expanded it, that's when we really saw the drop. So just wanted to make that clear. We still had a lot of work to do. And now the work got even harder.
I appreciate it. And Dr. Bertoni, I think you've brought an excellent transition point into hearing from two of our other panelists, in that you're talking about really what we have to do in order to meet this transformational moment is to focus on all learners, and particularly adults. And already the governor and the legislature have done a good deal to reach into those federal dollars and support adults. So why don't we go ahead and welcome our other two panelists. I am happy to introduce the author of our legislation and this task force, Representative Julie McCluskey, and also Pat Myers, who is our Chief Recovery Officer for the state. So with no further ado, we'll do a bit of a Q&A with you, and again, open it up to my colleagues to have opportunity to spend time with you, albeit virtually. Representative McCluskey, I just want to make sure you're able to join us because excellent many hats today. So welcome back from your JVC seat. We're glad that you're here. And why don't I kick this off with a question for you? So as I said, you are the mother of HB 1330 and likely any subsequent legislation that would come from this. So the speaker talked about the bipartisan support that he saw that there was for 6 recommendations that came from 95. And the desire to really focus on this once in a generation opportunity. So if you can comment a little about how you are looking at approaching this with your colleagues.
Well, first of all, Kristen, thank you. I am so grateful to be here today. And I want to express my gratitude to the many of you who have participated in the 1330 task force work. Whether you've been a member of the task force or one of the sub-panels or participating through your institution, I think it speaks so highly of the talent, the expertise, and just that commitment to collaboration that we have in higher education, that I'm really excited to see not only the report, but the possibilities ahead and where the state can now go with this list of recommendations and conversations that are informing what we need to do to help evolve our higher education ecosystem, how we can think about partnerships with industry and business leaders, and really start to hone in on what we need to do to keep our workforce learning, growing, and thriving. The report just recently released, I think, is a brilliant, it kind of captures the moment of what Colorado's just been through. We know there was tremendous pressure on our institutions and on the students attending those institutions. And we have now taken some of the deeper thoughts and hopes and translated those into very actionable next steps. I would hate to get out ahead of my colleagues. I have worked with so many brilliant minds in the legislature who are invested in their work through the education committees, but certainly those that also participated in 1330. And I think because we are dealing with, dollars for affordable housing, dollars for behavioral health, dollars for workforce revitalization, and then an even bigger, broader bucket around economic recovery and relief. I think we're trying to think about all of these efforts in a kind of a broad, big picture way. How do we include, how do we move legislation forward that continues to honor the many, many voices that have been at the table crafting or developing these ideas? In conversations that I've had so far, I think there's a lot of interest from my colleagues to get involved in the legislation. I appreciate, Kristen, that you called me the mother of 1330. There's probably been some people who might not use quite that word, and certainly think about this as simply the starting point, right? This is where we begin the work, not end it. The 1330 report that's just come forward is really the start of the next phase, and how we take the dollars available to us, invest them in these top priority ideas, work with one another, work with our partners in our communities. Landon, your question about rural Colorado, wow, I think these regional grants really speak to that goal and mission, that hope that we can work for communities in ways that mean the most to the communities. And so using the ARPA dollars, using these ideas, and then letting the voices speak, letting leaders in communities come forward for those grant requests. I have had, and I want to say quickly, Kristen, I've had a number of people ask me, how do I get involved? I don't want to see these ideas move forward without that ongoing stakeholding and partnership. And I can tell you, just based on what I've seen so far, based on the leaders that are on today's call and conversation, I think there's a real commitment to making sure that we're not moving anything forward without opportunities for input, feedback, and voice. So I think that will be key to the success of any legislation.
Wonderful, wonderful. Pat, I'd love to pivot to you and get your perspective on the administration's priorities as you reflect on this report and as you think about the broader commitments and priorities of the governor. What stands out for you as real opportunities for transformation?
Thanks, and I won't be as articulate as Rep. McCluskey because she is smarter than I am, but thank you very much for inviting me. It's fun to be here and to see a bunch of old friendly names, if not faces. Wanted to start by just again thanking the task force and also the subpanels. I got to sit on one of the subpanels. Really an interesting process that I had not seen in state government before. It brought together a lot of subject matter experts from a pretty broad category of people, but also want to thank Dr. Piccioni, my colleague, and the Department of Higher Ed, and all the work that they've put into this as well. And I'm certainly not here as an expert on education. I'll defer to my friend Angie for that. But I am pretty good at economics and pretty good at hopefully helping to spend ARPA money. To your question, I think just by way of background a little bit, you may all recall that when we realized we were going to get close to $4 billion in ARPA funding, that the governor and legislators and the state treasurer did a listening tour. And what came out of that listening tour were 4 broad areas that have already been commented on here: behavioral health, housing, economic relief, and workforce as sort of the top concerns statewide. That wasn't just Front Range. This listening tour was all over the state. And workforce was definitely a concern. And if anything, I would say workforce from a economic viewpoint has become more of a concern. And it's a concern in an interesting way because you've got this incredible, to me anyway, disconnect where you've got, something like 100,000 open jobs in the state of Colorado and something like 80,000 unemployed people that are still seeking work. And you're not combining those two, or we haven't found a way to combine those two in a way that you're putting the job seekers with the open positions. And that was kind of, to me, one of the directions that the governor gave me in my role on the 1330 task force, which is how do you bridge that gap? And how do you think really holistically? So it's a combination, it's very collaborative. It's not just one group is going to go solve the problem, because that probably is not going to happen. It's going to be a combination of higher ed, of local community organizations, of business, which is going to come out and say, and has, and said, this is what we need. And how do we work with the state and the locals and higher ed, which is part of the state, to solve that. And so I think a lot of these recommendations, and again, I'm not an expert on a lot of this stuff, but it seemed to me that really the group came together and came up with proposals that really addressed what's going on currently in the workforce. And finally, I would say the other thing that has become readily apparent recently is healthcare workforce, which is not only in pretty rough shape right now, but we think over the next 5 years will become worse unless we take steps right now to address it. And I think this is also an opportunity. The 1330 work is also an opportunity to address that.
Thank you, Pat. Representative McCluskey, one of the strengths of this process that Pat pointed out, which is unique among states as a response to the federal infusion of funds, is how collaborative we were as we sprinted virtually. We also have, our presidents have collaborated. They have jointly signed on to a letter to the JBC, which really points out the same point that Pat just made, that, like 53% of our nurses are educated out of state. And so is it the healthcare shortage that you're inclined to prioritize? Or can you comment at all on how you think about prioritizing action that would require legislation in this report?
Thank you, Kristen, for the question. Let me start by talking about funding. The Joint Budget Committee is well underway and carefully considering the governor's budget proposal. I think this committee in particular has been very committed to driving more funding to education, early childhood, K-12, and higher education, recognizing that the state has fallen behind. Certainly, we're not even at the median of what most states are funding in those buckets, and we have a ways to go. And I think the pandemic has exacerbated some of the challenges that our institutions have certainly faced historically, and now because of this moment, those funding needs are very real. I am incredibly impressed and proud to see eliminating equity gaps in the 1330 report and the commitment that members made in saying, we've got to do more, and we've got to do more for this workforce. I think funding in general, when we talk about K-12 funding or higher ed, we know that dollars need to go to students who may be from backgrounds of poverty, students that may be first generation, and students that historically have been underrepresented on our campuses. And whether it's wraparound services, student support services, or simply just an extra dollar for housing, food, or those other needs, I really believe that the Joint Budget Committee, all 6 of us, recognize these challenges, these needs, and I hope that we can deliver a really strong funding investment for our institutions this year. Stay tuned. There are more conversations and work to be done on that front. I think, the rest of your question about just legislation and, my hat is off to Pat and the team over at OEDIT. Also want to thank Dr. Piccioni, this collaboration and how we all work together. The second floor of the Capitol, the legislative branch, I think while we may be driving that policy, there really is no intention to leave anybody behind. And I think some of our conversations on the heels of the release of the report continue to demonstrate that. Whether we're talking about data systems, we know we're going to have a lot of people in the room to figure out what that pipeline looks like. Or if we're talking about, these regional partnership grants and industry, labor, opportunities to be working regionally with workforce development councils and centers. I think there's a lot of appetite to continue that kind of dialogue. And certainly while we have the 95 million in one-time ARPA dollars, they have a shelf life, they're expiring. We need to be smart and strategic about those investments right now. And yes, we can do that with the legislation to stand up and drive programming. I hope it's starter money, seed money for ongoing innovation in higher education, and that we really jumpstart some of the exciting ideas I've heard about out there in the world of higher education, and certainly with hopes that this work continues and that we're able to drive the dollars to fund this good work.
Wonderful. That'll give you the last programmed question, and it really builds off what Representative McCluskey and you have said. So if these regional, if regional partnerships were to come together to address this gap, the gap between 100,000 open jobs and 80,000 people seeking good jobs, do you have any red flags for us? Do you have any advice for us on timing? Because indeed, at the regional level, people are already coming together in these different types of consortia that you say are critical. So any just advice for us on the call who are part of those conversations?
A little, and I want though to just say that Rep. McCluskey's point on equity is exactly, I couldn't agree more with that. And one of the things you're seeing in the economy is our economy, if you just look at raw numbers of unemployment, is actually pretty good. But minorities have not participated, women have not participated as much. There are reasons for that, including probably lack of childcare, but really, and rural. There are rural areas that have not participated as much as other parts of the state. And so I think one of the goals of all of this should be to really drill down on all segments of the state, and how can we help all of us improve. To your question, so Rep. McCluskey said there's a shelf life to ARPA dollars, and it's a pretty quick shelf life. It has to be obligated by the end of 2024, and obligated means under contract, which means you have to have an obligation to pay somebody these dollars. Otherwise, it reverts back to the federal government. And then, even if it's obligated, you only have until 26 to pay it out. And I think we all know that 2 years sounds like a long time until all of a sudden you look back and realize that 2 years just went by really quickly. And because this is going to take a legislative process, and it's going to take collaboration, and exactly how are we putting together these programs, including the regional grant program. And then you have to put in place the administration to actually make it happen. I think all of us that have worked on this and worked on other ARPA functions have a sense of urgency. We also realize we have to go through a process, and we also realize that that process has to recognize that ARPA has a whole lot of rules to it. And so you have to comply with the rules, otherwise it doesn't do you any good, because they'll come back in and audit and say you owe us the money back. And so part of my job is to make sure that we're following those guardrails, if you will, as it's being legislated. But I really think what I'm optimistic about is that people have worked very quickly over a span of a few months and been very thoughtful. I thought the report was very thoughtful, and have really sought to address what I think her bill, Rep. McCluskey's bill, was meant to address. So I have a lot of hope. I think the agencies are very much on board with all of this, and Dr. Piccioni is. And so I feel like we'll get there, but I also feel like we need to keep that sense of urgency to be able to meet the timelines.
Thank you. So to summarize, collaboration, equity, creating pathways and opportunities for those who have been most disproportionately harmed by the pandemic and the transformations that have occurred in the economy, those historically left behind, and then also urgency. So thank you for those guidelines for our early conversations, and also for your stewardship of this process. It is, we're grateful that you are the one that has to worry about this, in threading in all the federal guidelines, and we'll just work on good collaborative ideas. It looks like Rebecca Holmes has a question for us. Rebecca, want to come off mute and share that with Representative McCluskey?
Sure, Rep. McCluskey, it's nice to see you. I'm sorry not to be on camera, I'm in transit, but I put a question here in the chat. In the introduction to the report, we see references to changes in high school practice and high school policy to try to drive more alignment between what we do, particularly in 9-12, and what happens in workforce and higher ed. And I listed in there parenthetically all sorts of policy priorities: assent, concurrent enrollment, graduation guidelines, issues of quality measures. But I'm curious what you think needs to change most specifically so that we can drive more alignment and have our high school graduates more and more ready for workforce and higher ed.
Really big, bold question. Thank you, Rebecca. Some of you, I believe, have been working with me and with others we've been working for a number of years. I certainly want to credit the governor's office, Misty Ruthven, who was with DHE, who was with CDE, who had been a partner with me when I was very first elected 3 years ago, to look at these programs, whether it's P-TECH, early colleges, Ascent, even concurrent enrollment. How are those 5th and 6th year transition programs, concurrent enrollment certainly earlier than that, how are they helping us? How are they helping the students identify pathways and or get that jump start on their post-secondary credential? I think the report highlights that. 1330 certainly lifts up the blur. How do we create pipelines that are more effective, certainly easier for students, remove barriers, and maybe tailored to specific student needs, hopes, or wants? I think while concurrent enrollment, and I want to lift up Senator Bridges, who I see here on today's conversation, he's been a leader on concurrent enrollment. I was happy to join him in some legislation early on, but I think even concurrent enrollment, while it's expanded, it hasn't been easy for our rural communities to really develop programs that are robust and meaningful for students. Maybe a lack of resources, or maybe there's more we can do to make the program that much more flexible and accessible to different types of school districts and communities. Rebecca, I think you hit on an area. It's lifted up in the report. I have been working on legislation for a couple of years now in this space, and I really am excited because I think there's momentum building for us to do even more, whether that's creating more, driving more funding to the programs, allowing them to stay in silos, or think about them more under maybe one umbrella. And how can students, say in Delta, Colorado, access the same types of opportunities as students here in Denver or students out on the Eastern Plains? How can we really broaden that 3rd, 4th, 5th year, in 5th, 6th year in the P20 pipeline, so that there are more opportunities and certainly more and better, richer experiences?
Excellent. I see a question from my fellow colleague, trustee at Adams State, David Hamburg.
Thank you so much, Kristen, and thank you to everyone that worked on this report. It's truly excellent work done in a remarkably short amount of time, and it's exciting to see this momentum build at such a really pivotal time in our state. I'm really supportive of all 6 recommendations. I love that the data system comes in at number 2. I see that as a foundational component that will help us both be successful in the other 5 elements, but also measure our success in the other 5 elements. So really critical. But I think the rubber really meets the road in the final 2. And I see them as inseparably connected. And I'm wondering about if there were any conversations both in the legislature among the report authors as to how we might create a finance plan that prioritizes equity. I think the research is quite clear that when it comes to student success, especially for underrepresented and minoritized populations, money just can't be overstated. It's critical both to drive money to those students, but particularly, and probably where we've not done a very good job at all, is driving money to the institutions that serve them, that the dollars to those institutions reap tremendous benefits in the outcomes for underrepresented and minoritized populations. And so I'm wondering about thoughts about how we could create a strategic finance plan that really prioritize equity in a substantive way.
amazing question and obviously a challenging one. I'd like to jump in maybe to start and Pat, kick it over to you. I think, David, the new higher ed funding formula, which has only been in use for 1 year, in part because of the pandemic, provides space for more targeted investments in step one. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the formula and how it played out last year, but members of the Joint Budget Committee came together and said, we do want to prioritize funding for our Pell students, our underrepresented minorities, our first-gen students. And we included in that step one, that base building part of the formula, a focus on retention. And while we don't anticipate that the dollars that came last year, completely turn around, provide the resources necessary for institutions to ensure that they retain every student, I think it did set the start of a conversation. And even the higher ed funding formula or request that we've received this year that would go through the formula asks for even more dollars in that first step to drive to these populations, again, with a focus on retention. And I think that's the start of this. I anticipate the higher ed funding formula comes up again for review in just 2 short years. But we are going to see how these dollars play out. And if we are able to deliver on the ask from the institutions, that means we're driving very specific money, not certainly to our access institutions, but to the students, no matter where they are currently. We're making sure that those dollars are flowing to those populations at the institutions. And I don't want to overstate this because I know the need for funding in higher education is significant. While I think this is a good step, there's certainly more we can do.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to that. I think, first of all, when I was at CU Denver in the Stone Age, I think that the state contributed something like 90 or 95% of tuition costs, and now it's well under 5%. And so it's been a pretty dramatic shift in the last, 30, 40 years in funding. And it's difficult. When I was with the Hickenlooper administration, we faced the same problems as governors before us. And how do you fix that, particularly when you're dealing with Tabor and at the time Gallagher and it's certainly a difficult problem. David, to your point, the thing about ARPA, I guess a couple of things about ARPA funds. One, they are sort of across the board aimed, or the preference is for disproportionately disadvantaged people, disadvantaged by COVID. And there are a lot of different definitions in the Treasury guidelines, but definitely the population that you're talking about is a population that the American Rescue Plan Act aims at. That's good. What's not as good is this is not ongoing money. It's one-time money. And what at least I've been and the governor has been thoughtful about is that you don't want to put one-time money and spread it out so thin, trying to cross a lot of different programs for a couple of years and have no real transformation at all. And then no ongoing funding to be able to keep whatever you were putting in place going after a couple of years. Because a couple of years in just about any program, whether it's education or otherwise, is not going to transform what we need to transform. So I'm hoping, as Rep. McCluskey said, that this money is the start. It puts in plumbing, if you will, or that will continue to have an effect on the state, if that makes any sense. But I totally take your point. It's a great question.
Thank you for your incredibly thoughtful responses, both of you. Again, we're privileged to have you in service and to have you with us today. I'll give Pat you the last word, and really effectively the governor the last word. We all trustees serve at his will. Any final remarks first as we start our 2022 related either specifically to 1330 and how you'd like to see us engage with these recommendations, or anything more broadly and related to Colorado's future?
Well, as Rep. McCluskey said, I don't want to get ahead of the process. I think the trustees are going to be incredibly important here. I think, first of all, you're in many ways the subject matter experts on education, higher ed. And so you're going to be a very, very critical voice, whether the programs, in my view anyway, whether the programs are necessarily coming directly from higher ed or whether it's business saying, hey, this is something that we need, that we could collaborate with locals to put a program in place to target high schoolers. A quick aside, I was on nuclear submarines for 6 years, and I was back when the USS Colorado was commissioned, and the foreman of where they build submarines said, one of our biggest problems in building submarines is we don't have welders. And so we now hire kids in high school to start teaching them how to weld. So by the time they graduate from high school, they can actually work on a nuclear submarine. And we need to get away, in my view, from apprenticeships and vocational just being limited to trades. I think it can be a lot more than that. But I think that's where your expertise comes into play. And I think the governor would agree. The governor started the 1330 process with saying, think big, be transformational, come up with really big ideas. And I think hopefully we're on a path for that.
Appreciate that. Thank you so much. We invite you to stay for the balance of our 6-minute call. But with that question I asked, I open it up to my colleagues. If you have any questions for Representative McCluskey or Pat, or if you want to comment on how you think trustees can respond to this charge to think big and to engage these issues of meeting learners where they are and making sure that they are connected to the good jobs that we have here in Colorado. All right. Seeing none, I think I'll turn it back over then to our co-chair, Elaine. If you have any remarks for us, a charge, if you have next steps for us.
Well, I think we have a unique opportunity to provide feedback to Representative McCluskey regarding whatever bills are going to be drafted and the recommendations. So Representative McCluskey, how would you like to get input and feedback from trustees as we move forward?
Great question. I will certainly put my contact information in the chat. I would encourage all of you to be working through your presidents, your CEOs. They are, I know, often in meetings together and have been talking about some of the 1330 recommendations. There will be a number of legislators, I am confident, involved in this space, certainly from the education committees. And all of you have built relationships with your senators and representatives. Encourage you to keep that up and communicating there. There may be more formal stakeholding opportunities once draft legislation is developed and getting it out there for input. I'm always happy to take an email or a phone call, and I'm sure Dr. Piccioni and her team happy to do so as well. So yes, thank you. Great question, Elaine. Love to have as much conversation as we can at this stage.
And before we wrap up, Angie, is there anything you'd like to say or make a comment?
Thanks, and thanks to everyone being on the call, but thanks to you, Elaine, and Sarah. I'm not sure if Sarah's on the call, but just for spearheading the CTN, but also making these times available for all of us to have to listen and to have a voice. But there's going to be a lot of work coming down the pike to not only to spend the 95, 96 million, but also the other important objectives that both the commission and the department and the institutions are wanting to do this year. I think everybody's really excited, and it's nice to see higher ed be excited for the legislative session and for what's possible. And so I think if we keep this momentum and this kind of a mindset, that it's going to take us where we need to go. We do have this unique opportunity, and I'm excited to be part of it. So thanks everyone for joining in.
Thanks, Angie. So as we wrap up, I want to remind all the trustees that on February 24th, from 9 to 1, the department, and CTN is also a co-host, is going to be hosting their annual trustee convening. And at that convening, we're going to be going into much more detail on the recommendations from 1330. Today was kind of a snapshot, but we're going to be going into much more depth at that time. So we hope that everybody either has signed up or will sign up for February 24th. And Angie, you okay? Okay, good. And I just want to say thank you to Kristen. You did a great job moderating. Pat, welcome to the world of education and higher education. We think we're very unique in the world of education, but I imagine you're dealing with every sector in state government. And Representative McCloskey, we're very happy you're chairing the JBC. You're very thoughtful, you understand the issues, and it makes us feel very good to have someone like you in that position. So with that, we'll say thank you. If you have any feedback in terms of today's forum, how to improve it, what you thought about it, feel free to contact me. Thank you very much and have a great evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.